Oh boy, we've got ourselves a doozy with this one here. Final Fantasy VIII is notorious for having a convoluted story with all sorts of twists and tangles, so grab a snack, grab a blanket, and get cozy while we unravel the tale of Sorceress Ultimecia and her deeds spanning as much time as she could find. The legends tell of a great being named Hein. Hein was incredibly powerful, but he grew tired of fighting monsters by himself, and so he decided to create people to do the work for him, and then he went to sleep. Upon awakening, Hein was surprised by the sheer quantity of the people around, and so he decided to cull the population. To do this, he decided to take away the children, but the people had grown attached to the children and they revolted. Despite his strength and vast knowledge of magic, there were just too many people and they had begun to outsmart him. As a peace offering, Hein offered the humans half of his body and went into hiding with his other half. Another war between the humans began, this time for control over Hein's body. However, the Zabalga tribe, who had ended up with control over the body, was unable to extract any power from it. Realizing they had been duped and that Hein had left them with the useless half of his body, the Zabalga clan was furious and vowed to destroy Hein. Hein himself never resurfaced after this, and the tales say that the magic of Hein took on the form of women, who would be referred to as sorceresses, or witches. According to a Balam Garden lecture shown in the Ultimecia, there have been 3 significant witches throughout history. None of them are directly named, though it is reasonable to assume the identities of 2 of them. The first sorceress stood up for her people and had a movie made about her and her knight, Zephyr. The second sorceress divided the world in the Sorceress War, and we can reasonably assume that this one is Adel. The third sorceress is familiar to Garden and cooperated in researching the mechanics of magic so that everyone would be able to use it, and it's fair to assume that this one is Edea. Some sorceresses decide to take on some extra protection in the form of a knight. All of the known sorceresses have been female, and similarly, all known knights have been male. As we just mentioned, Adel played a heavy role in the Sorceress War. She ruled over Esthar, one of the 2 major governing bodies at the time, and with her lust for power, wanted to conquer the Galbadian continent as well. Selphie hints that Adel's rise to power in Esthar might have been a violent one, when she comments on Edea assassinating President Delling, saying, "This was exactly like the Sorceress War with Adel." Esthar would discover a structure known as the Crystal Pillar, which had the capability to trigger the Lunar Cry, causing monsters to come pouring down from the moon. Adel tasked Dr. Odine with designing the Lunatic Pandora, a structure that would encompass the Crystal Pillar and allow her to weaponize it in their war versus Galbadia. When a sorceress passes away, in order to pass on properly, they must pass their sorceress powers onto another person before or as they die. Adel had no such successor to her powers lined up, and so she began a worldwide search for one. She ordered the Estharian army to raid the world, kidnapping little girls so that Adel could assess them and hopefully find a proper heir to her throne. The search would culminate with the kidnapping of Ellone, a young girl from the town of Windhill, and Adel deeming her to be a viable successor. While she never became a sorceress, Ellone still plays a significant role in the story and is targeted by multiple sorceresses due to her abilities. She naturally had the ability to communicate telepathically with others, as well as send their consciousness back in time to experience the memories of anyone else that she has met. Ellone grew up in Windhill, and her parents were killed during Adel's initial search for an heiress. but she managed to avoid capture and was instead raised by her neighbor, Rain. During Adel's second search, however, she was not so fortunate. She would be captured and taken to Esthar, where she would be held captive and Dr. Odine would research her special ability. Odine managed to discover the method by which Ellone's abilities worked, and was able to replicate them in his new invention, Junction Machine Ellone. After the Sorceress War had ended, Ellone was sent back to Windhill to live with Rain. Rain unfortunately passed away shortly after Ellone's return, and Ellone, alongside Rain's new child, Squall, were sent to Edea's orphanage to be raised. Edea was the matron of the orphanage where Ellone, Cypher, and the majority of the playable cast grew up. She inherited her sorceress powers originally when she was 5, and then had another encounter with a sorceress 13 years before the game began, but we'll return to that point later. At the same time as her second sorceress encounter, Edea came up with the idea for Seed and Garden, and set that idea into motion. Rinoa was the daughter of General Caraway of the Galbadian military, as well as the singer Julia Hartley, and was the only playable character to have never lived at Edea's orphanage. She inherits her sorceress powers from Edea at the end of the game's second disc, but we'll cover that when the time comes. And finally, we make it to our main topic for today. The final sorceress that plays a role in Final Fantasy VIII's storyline is our girl from the future, Ultimecia. Ultimecia exists in an unknown future time period where she appears to be the ruler. Her ultimate goal is to achieve time compression, creating a world consisting of all of time where she would be the only person able to exist. In order to achieve time compression, she needs to send her consciousness far back into the past where she can begin casting her time compression spell. She uses a refined version of Junction Machine Ellone to achieve this, and sends her consciousness to the main time period of Final Fantasy VIII, where she possesses sorceresses to search for Ellone who could send her even further back. As I mentioned earlier, Esthar was one of the two major factions participating in the Sorceress War. Led by Adel, the ultimate goal was conquest over the Galbadian continent. In terms of Galbadia's participation in the war, we get to see a couple scenes play out from a troop of Galbadian soldiers led by Laguna Loire. The second Laguna flashback shows Laguna, Ward, and Kiros as they attempt to deter Esthar from taking control of the Crystal Pillar. The three of them fight their hardest through the pillar, but the Esthar soldiers manage to severely injure the group. After escaping the pillar, Laguna winds up in the town of Windhill, where he is nursed back to health by Rain. In Windhill, he hunts monsters to keep the town safe, and acts as a father figure to Ellone, until Adel's second search for an heiress where Ellone was kidnapped. Once Ellone was kidnapped, Laguna would journey over to Esthar on a quest to rescue her. Unrelated to the main plot, but to fund the journey, Laguna took on an acting role in a movie about the life of the unnamed sorceress that we mentioned earlier. From the filming location, Laguna notices the lunatic Pandora floating off in the distance and questions what it is. Laguna, along with Ward and Kiros, join the Estharian resistance against Adel, and come up with a plan to stop her reign of terror. They work with Dr. Odine to come up with a new mechanism to restrain and seal away Adel. The Resistance sink the lunatic Pandora into the ocean and lure Adel over to the Sorceress Memorial, claiming that the culprit who sunk it was inside and holding Ellone hostage, knowing that the mention of Ellone would bait Adel inside. Once inside, Adel realizes that she had been duped, and that the Ellone she was seeing was only a hologram, but it was too late. Laguna was able to catch Adel off guard and shove her backwards, allowing Ward and Kiros to activate their trap to seal her away. To ensure that she remains sealed, they launch Adel's tomb into outer space and place it on the moon. Since the crystal pillar had been sunk beneath the ocean, and therefore could not trigger the Lunar Cry, she should, in theory, remain there. With Adel defeated, Laguna sends Ellone back to Windhill and promises to rejoin once he finishes up his business in Esthar. This would never end up being the case, however, as Rain would pass away shortly after and Ellone would be sent off to Edea's orphanage. Laguna would then go on to become the president of Esthar for the next 17 years. Edea and her husband Sid started up Garden and the Seed program with the objective of fighting sorceresses when the time came. This purpose was kept a secret from the majority of people, including the Seeds, as they were taught their purpose was just to be mercenaries for hire. In order to fund the project, Sid teamed up with a Shumi named Norg, who provided the majority of the capital used to construct Garden and come up with the Seed training programs. Norg was also the one who came up with the idea of dispatching Seeds as mercenaries around the world as a way of recuperating some of the costs. Esthar had continued to pursue Ellone to continue Dr. Odine's research, so in addition to Garden, Edea had a special white Seed ship built, where she and Ellone would live to protect Ellone from being kidnapped by Esthar again. Sid became obsessed with Seed, but he did have one concern with its goal. He had known that Edea had been a sorceress since her childhood, and was worried that Seed's ultimate goal of combating sorceresses would lead them to fight against his wife. Edea assured him that that would never happen, but that all changed when Ultimecia had possessed her body through junction machine Ellone. Reaching the events of the game, Ultimecia has taken control over Edea's body and infiltrated the Galbadian government. The Seed exam from the start of the game has Garden assisting Dalit defend against a Galbadian invasion, where Galbadia tries to repair the Dalit radio tower. With the radio tower up and running, Galbadia was then able to use the Timber broadcast station to launch the first televised broadcast in 17 years. During the broadcast, President Delling appoints Edea as the ambassador for Galbadia, but is interrupted when Cypher breaks into the station and takes him hostage. He runs away with the president, but is stopped by Edea as she teleports in. She takes control of Cypher's mind and takes him with her back through her portal. The official story is that Cypher was executed after this, but the reality was that he had become a knight for Sorceress Ultimecia. The head of Galbadia Garden, Martine, briefs the party on the situation after this. Officially, Edea was appointed as the peace ambassador, but this is only a facade covering up their true plans. Their goal was clearly world domination, and the sorceress is simply an intimidation tactic. He then gives them their next assignment, approved by both Balam and Galbadia Garden, to assassinate Sorceress Edea. They were to team up with a sniper provided to them by Galbadia Garden, meet up with General Caraway, and assassinate her during an upcoming parade. Rinoa tries to assist the assassination plan in her own way by bringing an Odine bangle to Edea as a gift, which in theory should have suppressed her sorceress powers. Edea, however, saw through this plan and enchants Rinoa's mind before going out to give a speech. Her speech is given in a very surprising manner, though. She begins by insulting the crowd, questioning why they were celebrating her ascension despite the tales of an evil, ruthless sorceress, and then demonstrates her power by killing President Delling. The crowd, entranced this whole time, cheers her on. She finishes up her speech by saying, "Let's end this ceremony with a sacrifice," brings a couple of statues to life, and has them attack a charmed Rinoa. Squall and Irvine jump into action and deal with the now living statues, while Edea goes to begin her parade. Zell, Quistis, and Selphie wait until Edea's float passes under the archway, and then activate the gates, trapping her in place for Irvine to take the shot. Irvine hesitates, but eventually manages to take the shot. However, Edea blocks the bullet, and Squall enacts the backup plan and leaps in to fight the sorceress directly. Her new knight Cypher steps in to defend her, but Squall defeats him, and Irvine and Rinoa join Squall to engage Edea. She entertains them for a bit, until she conjures an ice shard and sends it flying into Squall's chest. Now, depending on how many fan theories you may have read, the actual story just ends here, and the rest of the game is simply Squall's last thoughts before he dies. For the sake of the video, however, let's continue on. Edea has the party arrested and taken to the D District prison outside of Galbadia. While most of the party is kept in a cell, Squall is brought to a special torture chamber where Edea has Cypher torture him for information regarding Seed. Despite controlling Edea's body, Ultimecia didn't have access to her memories, and so she was unaware of Seed's true purpose, and tries to have Cypher torture it out of Squall. Squall hadn't yet been filled in on Seed's true purpose though, and so despite the torturing, he's unable to provide Cypher with any information. Ultimecia still has her suspicions though, and declares Garden a threat and orders it destroyed. She orders the Galbadian missile base to prepare missiles to launch towards Balam and Trebia Garden. While Selphie goes to deal with the missiles, why is error ratio a setting? The White Seed ship arrives at Garden to take Ellone back into their custody. This is fortunate timing for them, as we later learn in Fisherman's Horizon, FH, that Galbadia has begun searching the world for her. Edea commandeers Galbadia Garden and uses it to wage an all-out war on Balam Garden. She intercepts Balam in the Centra continent as the party goes to investigate Edea's orphanage, after regaining some of their memories of growing up there. Not knowing that Edea is possessed by Ultimecia, the party is slightly hesitant about fighting her, but Squall gives a pep talk to remind everyone of their duty and what they signed up for. After fighting their way into Galbadia Garden, Squall and friends work their way up to Cypher and Edea. They defeat Edea this time, freeing her from Ultimecia's control, but Rinoa starts acting strangely after the fight. Unbeknownst to Edea, being defeated here caused her sorceress powers to transfer to a new host, and Rinoa just happened to be the nearest viable candidate. Separated from Edea, Ultimecia also needed a new host to latch onto, and so she moved on to possess the new sorceress, Rinoa. Rinoa walks over to Cypher's body and whispers some instructions to him. He was to find the lunatic Pandora hidden beneath the ocean, and she promises that the sorceress will provide him with dreams again, before collapsing into a coma. Edea, now free from Ultimecia's possession, returns to her orphanage where she reveals to the party that she was possessed by a sorceress from the future, Ultimecia, who is searching for Ellone. Edea wasn't sure of Ultimecia's end goal, but suspected that Adel may still be alive and may play a part in Ultimecia's plans. The party, unaware of what just happened to Rinoa, seeks out Ellone, who is now an Esthar, but actually has been launched into space, to see if she can shine some light on Rinoa's condition. Meanwhile, Cypher obeys Ultimecia's command and raises the lunatic Pandora and drives it over to Tyr's Point to trigger the Lunar Cry. Ultimecia wishes to use the Lunar Cry to recover Adel's body from the moon and possess her body. With a possessed Adel, she then planned to seek out Ellone and have Ellone send her consciousness even further back in time, so that she could then cast her time compression spell. One extra step she needed, however, was to deactivate the seal on Adel's tomb, which she was able to do by taking command of Rinoa's body again inside the lunar base, before donning a spacesuit and taking Rinoa out into space to die. Squall charges out into space to rescue her, and the two of them witness the Lunar Cry while floating in space until they come across the lost Estharian ship, Ragnarok. After guiding the Ragnarok back to the planet, they are greeted by some Estharian soldiers who demand Squall hand Rinoa over to them on account of being a sorceress. Rinoa agrees to hand herself over and confesses her fears to Squall about not wanting to be a tool for Ultimecia to achieve her goal of time compression. The rest of the party convince Squall to go back to the Sorceress Memorial and fight to get Rinoa back. On their way out of the memorial, they are greeted by a new, yet familiar face. The president of Esthar had sent one of his comrades, Ward, to authorize them to leave with Rinoa. Rinoa requests to visit Edea's orphanage to keep her away from as many people as possible in the event that Ultimecia repossessed her. Squall and Rinoa have a heart-to-heart conversation there, when Zell interrupts them saying that Esthar had come up with a plan to defeat Ultimecia, and the president of Esthar wanted to hire Seed to carry out the plan. The president, Laguna, had worked with Dr. Odine to come up with a method to defeat Ultimecia. Odine was excited to reveal that one of his inventions, the junction machine Ellone, was being used in the future. Although, unfortunately, the use case for it was Ultimecia sending her consciousness back in time to wreak havoc in the present. Through the machine, Ultimecia learned of Ellone, which was why she chose this time to travel to. Odine concludes that the only way to stop Ultimecia is to kill her in the future, which sounds simple enough. Oh, my mistake. But he still does offer us a way to find Ultimecia. Her goal was to create a time compression by having Ellone send her consciousness even further back into the past and then casting her spell, so Odine says, bet. The problem is we have two sorceresses in our time, Adel and Rinoa. Given Adel's strength and nature, if Adel's consciousness were to win over Ultimecia's, then that would be catastrophic for the current era. And so the Seeds must kill Adel as soon as she awakens, leaving Rinoa as the only sorceress for Ultimecia to possess. Next, Ellone would send Rinoa and Ultimecia into the past far enough to let Ultimecia cast her time compression spell. Once she had begun casting it, Ellone would cut them off from the past, returning Rinoa and Ultimecia to their original times. Squall and the gang would be able to navigate the incomplete time compression and make their way to Ultimecia's time period where they would be able to confront and kill her. The Seeds head off to the lunatic Pandora to recover Ellone, who had been taken captive by Cypher after returning from space, and kill Adel. Cypher is defeated, but springs up, grabs Rinoa, and runs off. Rinoa pleads for Cypher to let her go, but Cypher is too far gone and only desires to fulfill Ultimecia's wish. He takes her to a now awakened Adel, possessed by Ultimecia, who grabs and junctions Rinoa to herself and fights the party. Throughout the fight, Adel drains Rinoa's energy to sustain herself, but the party is able to cut her down before losing Rinoa. On her deathbed, Adel has to pass on her sorceress powers, and Rinoa is there to accept them. With Rinoa now being the only sorceress remaining in this time period, Ultimecia possesses her, and Laguna and Ellone come in to enact the next phase of their plan. Ellone sends Ultimecia and Rinoa further into the past to possess a younger Adel, and then severs the connection once Ultimecia begins to cast her spell. Time begins to collapse into its incomplete, compressed state as the seeds navigate it with just a little bit of the power of friendship. In the time compression, they face off against 11 sorceresses from throughout time. After defeating the sorceresses, they arrive at their agreed-upon location, Edea's orphanage, where they finally arrive in the future, Ultimecia's timeline. Now in the future, the party finds Ultimecia's castle, floating off the coast, tethered to the ruins of Edea's orphanage. At the base of the chains lie seemingly the only other human inhabitants of Ultimecia's timeline, the corpses of some white seeds. In an effort to save on disk space, Ultimecia's time period has sealed away most major locations on the planet, leaving only a select few accessible. The major landmark of the future, which sadly didn't get represented on the world map, was the aforementioned Ultimecia's castle. Located throughout the castle are her various servants, consisting of corrupted monsters, weapons, or GFs. Within the bounds of the castle, these servants seal off the use of most abilities for anyone who enters. Ultimecia awaits the seeds in her throne room in the tower of her castle. When they approach her, she laments about them meddling in her plans to create a perfect time compression, and promises them a death beyond death, before she picks 3 random party members to be her first victims and attacks. True to her title of Sorceress, Ultimecia attacks with high-level magic, and if any party member is left KO'd for too long during the fight, she keeps her promise and grants them a death beyond death as the party member gets absorbed into time. After sustaining enough damage, she peers into Squall's mind to find what he imagines to be the strongest GF and summons Griever based on what she finds. After Griever sustains enough damage, she commands him to show them his true power by casting Shockwave Pulsar, before junctioning herself to Griever. After sustaining enough damage in this combined form, Ultimecia gets more desperate and extreme in her actions, taking on her final form by beginning to absorb time, space, and existence. In this form, she draws from the most powerful spells and abilities available. She has Hell's Judgment to drop everyone's hit points to 1, Apocalypse, which is even more powerful than Ultima, and her physical attacks will always critically strike. Despite her desperation, the seeds prevail over her with the help of an incredibly fair and balanced junction system, as well as a couple of holy wars. She uses her last moments to lament about the perpetuity of time, and no matter how strong you are, or how hard you try, time will always come out on top. With Ultimecia defeated, her time compression spell begins to unravel, and her time period begins to collapse. The seeds wander the emptiness of existence until Squall arrives at a familiar-looking location. This sorceress that Edea encountered 13 years prior to the start of the game was a dying Ultimecia. With nobody else existing in her time to pass her sorceress powers onto, she is forced to wander through time in search of a successor, and arrives at Edea's orphanage with Squall. Edea, already a sorceress, decides to absorb Ultimecia's powers herself to let Ultimecia pass on in peace, keeping the burden of becoming a sorceress away from any of the children. Squall then explains the situation to her, about how she would go on to create Garden and Seed with the objective of fighting that sorceress, both beginning and completing the cycle of Ultimecia's destiny. As I'm sure many of us recognize, Ultimecia's name is very similar to the word ultimate, which comes from the Latin word ultimatus, meaning furthest or last. This could be in reference to her position as the final boss of the game, or more likely, her position as the final sorceress in a long line of them. One of the game's main themes is succession of witches, the other being love, and the main villain, Sorceress Ultimecia's name literally means Final Sorceress, which is a neat allusion to the fact that she represents the end of that succession. This seems to be a reference added in by the game's English and French translations, however, as her Japanese name, as well as her name in the Italian and German localizations, hint at a different reference. Ultimecia, or Artemisia, could potentially refer to one of several women. Artemisia the First or Second of Caria, or Artemisia Gentileschi. Artemisia the First of Caria was the queen of Halicarnassus around 480 BCE, and she is most known for her role in the Battle of Salamis. Following the battles of Thermopylae and Artemisium, the Greeks decided to engage the Persians in a naval battle in the Strait of Salamis. The size of the Persian ships made navigating the narrow straits challenging, giving the Greeks an advantage despite being heavily outnumbered. In the aftermath of the battle, Xerxes acknowledged her achievements during the engagement and sought her advice on what to do next. Artemisia suggested that he personally retreat and leave the handling of the Greeks to his general Mardonius, saying that if Mardonius succeeded, the honor would still go to Xerxes because it would be his slaves who achieved victory, and if he failed, then Xerxes would be out of harm's way. Artemisia II of Caria was another queen of Halicarnassus from 353 to 351 BCE. Once her brother and husband, King Mausolus, had passed away, she had a unique way of grieving, as she was said to have mixed his ashes into her daily drink. Her largest claim to fame is overseeing the construction of the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, in the memory of her late brother/husband. And finally, Artemisia Gentileschi was an Italian painter who was the first woman to become a member of the Accademia delle Arti del Disegno. Her art style was noteworthy as her paintings often featured women as protagonists or equal to men, and the women lacked the stereotypical feminine traits. I think of the 3, either Artemisia I of Caria or Artemisia Gentileschi would be the most likely candidates as an inspiration for Ultimecia. Artemisia I of Caria was a queen who fought alongside the terrifying Xerxes the Great, and had advised him on an important tactical decision during a tough battle. Ultimecia is effectively the queen of her own time period, far into the future, and likely has many of her own battle achievements decorating her rise to power. Artemisia Gentileschi could fit as well, as prior to Ultimecia, the mainline Final Fantasy primary villains have all been male or of unknown gender. Similarly to Gentileschi going against the grain with her portrayal of women, Ultimecia being the main antagonist can be seen as empowering and demonstrating that women don't have to be relegated to a secondary role. The events at the end of Disc 1 draw some comparisons to the assassination of the American President John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963. At 11:55 a.m., the presidential motorcade would set off from the Love Field Airport, heading for downtown Dallas. Former Marine Lee Harvey Oswald had brought a rifle with him to work that morning at the Texas Schoolbook Depository, and had positioned himself by a sixth-story window with his rifle as the motorcade was scheduled to pass by. At 12:30 p.m., as the motorcade made a turn onto Elm Street and Dealey Plaza, Oswald fired 3 shots at Kennedy's car, killing the president and injuring Texas Governor John Connally. The route for the presidential motorcade had been publicized several days earlier in the newspaper, which enabled Oswald to plan out his shooting. Looking back at Final Fantasy VIII, we can see similarities to the incident. Much like how Oswald used his knowledge of the route to plan out the assassination, General Caraway had full knowledge of the parade route, as well as the timings of when the float would be at specific locations. The method of assassination was also similar, a rifle from a high vantage point. And finally, albeit under slightly different circumstances, the president of a nation was murdered. The overall tale of Ultimecia draws some comparisons to the Greek tales of both Oedipus and Perseus. I'm only going to dive into the tale of Oedipus since the stories are somewhat similar, but if you want the tale of Perseus, you can look up the events between him and his grandfather Acrisius. Oedipus was born to King Laius and Queen Jocasta of Thebes. Laius was given a prophecy by the oracle of Apollo that any son born to him would kill him. So when Oedipus was born, Laius had his ankles pierced and tethered together, and passed him off to one of his servants to abandon on the side of a mountain. The servant, however, would not abandon the child, but rather leave him with a shepherd. This shepherd would pass Oedipus on to another shepherd, and eventually Oedipus would end up being adopted by the king and queen of Corinth, Polybus and Merope. Years later, after learning that he was supposedly a bastard, Oedipus would seek the knowledge of the same oracle that had given Laius his prophecy. This time, the oracle would tell Oedipus that he was destined to kill his father and marry his mother. In an attempt to avoid this fate, he decides not to return to Corinth, but instead travel to Thebes. On his way there, he gets into a heated argument with a chariot driver, who, unbeknownst to him, is his real father, King Laius. Oedipus kills the man and then continues on his way to Thebes. The tale continues on, but we've covered the important parts relating to Ultimecia already. Both Laius and Oedipus seek out an oracle who provides them with a prophecy, but neither are satisfied with the prophecy they get, and so they go to great lengths to undermine it. However, their attempts to undermine fate end up causing the prophecy to be fulfilled, making the prophecy self-fulfilling. Ultimecia meets a similar fate as she hears the tales of a legendary seed, Squall, destined to face her, but her efforts to quash Seed would end up leading to the creation of Seed, guaranteeing her fate. The designs of Ultimecia and Rinoa share several similar yet contrasting points to highlight how they're intended to be the opposites of each other. Ultimecia dresses in red, Rinoa in blue. Rinoa has white angel wings, while Ultimecia's wings are black. Ultimecia's hair is white and resemble devil horns, and Rinoa just has plain black hair. And finally, their personalities are obviously very contrasting. Rinoa is shown to be a caring person. She obviously forms a strong bond and falls in love with Squall. But even beyond that, the second time we meet her in the game is when she hired us to help fight for the liberation of the town of Timber. On the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Ultimecia, where the only interactions we have with her is in her quest to create a world where nobody else could exist. In Final Fantasy VIII, we don't get very much in the way of backstory for Ultimecia, so her motivations are tricky to figure out. One of the two glimpses into her mind that we do get comes during a speech in Delling City, where she talks about how the crowd is celebrating her ascension as a sorceress despite generations of condemnation. She boasts about standing before them as the cold-blooded tyrant slaughtering countless men and destroying many nations, and even murders the president of Galbadia during her speech. But due to the charm she had placed on the crowd, they keep cheering her on despite what's happening. It's not clear whether the persecution she's talking about is historical or happened in the time between Final Fantasy VIII and Ultimecia's time period. However, I'm of the opinion that it's the latter. If Ultimecia had inherited her sorceress powers at a young age and faced persecution from everyone for the majority of her life as a result, then that could explain why she longs for destruction. Her ideal world of time compression would be a world where only she would be able to exist in, free of those who would condemn her simply for being a sorceress. It's implied that she had been fighting seeds for quite some time, as we can see the bodies of some white seeds on the ground just outside her castle, and just before the party fights her, she scorns the existence of seeds, comparing them to locusts swarming across generations. So perhaps the conflict between her and the seeds is what she is referring to here. We also see a bit of pettiness during her speech in Galbadia. She's not content with just ruling over the people who would condemn her. She has to enchant them, force them to cheer her on despite insulting them and killing their president in front of their very eyes. The other glimpse we get comes just as her HP is depleted, and she speaks her almost last words. She tells the party to reflect on their childhoods, and that time will not wait, but rather escape them, and then her last sentence is cut off. Although not canon to Final Fantasy VIII's timeline, Dissidia does complete this dialogue. If fought in Shade Impulse by anyone other than Squall, she repeats a slightly paraphrased version of these last words, except this time she gets to finish the sentence, showing that time escapes her as well. I look at this in potentially one of two ways. One interpretation would be that she longs to return to her childhood, potentially before she was cursed with the power of being a sorceress, and the other being a little bit more existential. Time escaping her could refer to her simply growing out of her childhood. A children's song that I grew up with, Puff the Magic Dragon, had a line going, "A dragon lives forever, but not so little boys. Painted wings and giant rings make way for other toys," referring to how children will grow up into adults, and the things that brought them joy as a child will eventually be replaced with other things such as responsibilities. If she still had memories of before she became a sorceress, she could yearn to go back to those days, before her childhood joys were forcefully replaced by conflict. The other interpretation, being a bit more existential, could imply that she's more concerned with her existence as a whole. If she was able to create a world where all times would exist, she could theoretically achieve a technical immortality as long as her spell lasted. I'm not going to delve too much into the concept of immortality here, however. I'll save that for when I make a video on Final Fantasy III. The game has attracted a couple of fan theories relating to Ultimecia and her actions. Squall is dead, and Rinoa is Ultimecia. Squall is dead refers to the idea that Squall may have died at the end of Disc 1, when Ultimecia had Edea impale his chest with an ice shard. The TLDR of the theory is that the remainder of the events in the game are a dream presented to Squall as his life flashes before his eyes after being killed by Edea. I'll link to a website detailing the whole theory for you to read if you're interested, but the specifics of the theory aren't relevant to Ultimecia, so I'll just discuss the potential ramifications. As Ultimecia isn't specifically referred to or mentioned until the beginning of Disc 3, this theory could imply literally anything about her. She could have not existed at all, could have been present in some other form, or maybe Squall's mind somehow managed to predict her exactly. The other theory is that Ultimecia is a future version of Rinoa. The basis of the theory is that Ultimecia is Rinoa from an alternate timeline, potentially one where she was hunted down by some other seeds after inheriting her sorceress powers at the end of Disc 2. Most versions of the theory that I've seen claim that she is sealed up in a similar manner to Adel for an unknown amount of time before waking up far into the future. In this future, without any of her friends or the man she loved, Squall, as well as some bitterness towards the seeds for sealing her away, she starts to lose who she was, potentially forgetting her original name even, and transforms into Ultimecia and begins her reign of terror. The theory also uses the juxtaposition between Rinoa and Ultimecia as a way of demonstrating her transformation. The change in symbolism from Rinoa being pure or good into Ultimecia's more typical evil references gives a physical representation of the change going on in Rinoa's mind, from being the freedom fighter when we first met her to the world-destroying Ultimecia. Personally, I don't subscribe to either of these theories, and Square Enix has officially denied both of them, but they can still be fun to think about, and of course, everyone is entitled to their own personal headcanons.